franchises in the podcast space, how to build enduring, lasting brands that reach people all over the world through audio. So without further ado, we're going to bring on Joe and Lauren and BP and Herman and Terry to talk about building franchises and podcasting. And then after this, please stick around. There's 2 more panels that will follow that are going to be really incredible. Thank you.
What's going on, everybody? Thank you for coming. Happy CES. Hope everybody's having a great time. You all look great. First day. Thank you for coming to our panel. This is I'm really honored to have the opportunity to moderate this with such an incredible cross-section of individuals from our industry. Whether you guys are in the business of podcasting or not, this is going to be a really good conversation amongst colleagues and friends about what the current state of the podcasting business is, and I hope everybody here takes something away that is useful. Thank you to CES, and thanks again for all of you coming here. My name is Joseph Schwartz. I am an agent at United Talent Agency in the live events and touring department, specializing on spoken word performers, specifically comedians and podcasters as of late. I'm going to let my fellow panelists introduce themselves, and I'm going to ask that everybody talk about one highlight from their 2018, just to give you guys a little taste of what we've all been up to and what we're proud of accomplishing. And last year, in the spirit of bringing in the new year by taking out the old. For me personally, I had the privilege of booking My Favorite Murder, which is a podcast, a comedy podcast for the largest attended show in podcast history at the Microsoft Theater in Los Angeles, for about 7,000 people on Halloween. And I will turn it to Lauren to continue.
Okay. Hi, I'm Lauren Jarvis. I run content partnerships at Spotify, and for us, as we increasingly seek to become a media-driven audio company beyond just serving music, that means that I look a lot after all of our podcast content partnerships, whether that is our existing partners in our catalog of over 180,000 podcasts, or the original and exclusive content that we license onto the platform. A highlight for me of 2018 would be, I think honestly, just having this panel exist, because 2018 was all about podcast awareness, and I think podcasts are in the mainstream now, and they never really have been before as a kind of commercial proposition, a broad-based consumer proposition as well. And then I will later on talk about some of the specific content franchises that I'm really proud of as well that we worked on at Spotify.
Excellent.
My name is Brett Patrick, or BP, as most people call me. I am the EVP and Head of Development at Propagate Content in Los Angeles. We produce a wide range of television shows and films, and have probably adapted more podcasts to TV than any other company in the world. I'm a huge fan of podcasts, but our company does everything from Charmed on the CW to Lore on Amazon, and several others, Up and Vanished on Oxygen, Sword and Scale at Hulu, and a number of others that are in the works. And I think there's several things, highlights from 2018 that I'm excited about. The first one being, I told my friends here I would only do this panel if we had fuzzy vanilla chairs, and I didn't think that we were going to get them, and we did. But second, Haunted on Netflix. I don't know if you got to see it, but that was like such a surprise hit for them that I'm really excited about, and so many other shows that we have in the works that have me motivated for years to come.
I'm Herman Lopez, the founder and CEO of Wondery. We're known for our immersive storytelling podcasts like Dr. Death, Dirty John, Business Wars. The most exciting thing that happened to us in 2018 is that we launched several shows, 9 of which reached #1 on Apple Podcasts, and between them, they spent 70 days at the top of the charts. Much better than we did last year, and something that we hope to accomplish again in 2019.
My name is Terry Miles, and this is the first podcast panel I've been on when I'm not laying on a Casper mattress and delivering my introduction.
That's being you requested the chairs.
Yeah, otherwise, yeah, Casper, oh my God, my whole house is sponsored. So I was a filmmaker, and filmmaking is mainly begging for money and trying to get permission to make movies. And so at a certain point, I'm a recovering musician as well, and I found my way into podcasting, and that's what I do now. I guess it's a micro studio of creating content, and the thing I'm most proud of in 2018 would be crossing 100 million downloads of the Black Tapes, Tanis, Rabbits, and the Last Movie podcasts.
Thank you. Very impressive, everyone. So the theme of this panel is building franchises. Obviously, there is a lot of content out there in the form of podcasts. So what we're here to talk about today is, as everybody here has experienced, creating, working with, developing, launching shows that have achieved extraordinary success. So the goal is to talk about sort of how that's been done with all of the clutter that's out there, and hopefully help everybody understand that a little better coming out of it. So Hernan, I'd like to start with you. 9 shows going to #1 in 2018. It's incredible, and you just have so much success with launching shows, and I would just love to hear you talk about a bit where you've had all these shows. Have you noticed between all of them any sort of through line, anything in common that makes them stand out? You know, when you're going to launch something, you go, hey, I think this is going to be a hit. How do you prepare for that? You know, it seems like you're getting to the point of just being a hit factory in terms of quantity, and I'm just curious what goes into your thought process when you are coming up with these shows.
Thank you. The test that we have, or when we know whether a show is going to really be a viral hit, is when we send an episode to some friends and employees, and without prompting, they text us back, when can I listen to the next one? That is the one key sign that tells you that people are really hooked on a story, that we've done a job at keeping listeners engaged minute by minute. But in order to get there, there are many things that have to go right before. First, we need stories that are universal, that have a point of relatability, that anybody can find something in common with the characters in the story. Second, we need to have the characters clearly delineated. Ideally, we want heroes and anti-heroes, but you won't get the anti-heroes in every single story. You won't get the heroes in every single story. But we find that the stories that tend to perform the best are the ones where you have a clear hero like Terra Newell in Dirty John, and a clear villain like John Meehan in Dirty John. And we look at many different instances in the story production that will determine whether we greenlight the story or not. One of them is access. Do we have access to the subjects that we're making story? Because the kind of shows that we're making, especially the event miniseries that we're talking about, are a mix between documentaries and character-driven dramas. So they borrow the storytelling style for the documentaries, but because they're serialized, they borrow the narrative structure of the character-driven drama that we're all familiar from watching television. And in order to get all of the elements from both sides of the fiction and the drama, you need to be disciplined. You need to ask the right questions at every step of the way.
It's funny to hear him bring those up, because I think, one, that's incredible insight into, I think, storytelling. And all those things really, I think, apply to all our favorite television shows and movies. I mean, all the things that we love that are box office successes have those same ingredients.
Yeah, and and that really, there's so so much connectivity between that. It's hard for me to decide who to talk to next after you say something like that, because everybody here has so much experience with that. And BP, you jumping in. I mean, when you have all these shows and you are so accustomed to seeing and identifying great narratives and determining what is especially ripe for adaptation. I'd just love to hear you talk a little bit about your process and your team when you have people creating this great content, determining what you think would be best for adaptation and finding it amongst all of the content that currently exists.
Good question. One of the things I love about podcasts in general is that they've kind of democratized the ability to be a global storyteller. Hollywood has such a velvet rope, but with podcasts, we've seen people like, my friend Pam Lindsay, like literally kind of emerge from nowhere. That's insane. But I think his talent and ability speaks to all the things that Hernan just brought up. So when we're trying to curate original podcasts, or we're trying to develop them, or we're trying to identify them, I talk to buyers every day, whether it's our friends at Spotify or Apple or Netflix or CBS, and we're constantly dialoguing about what is on and trends that are emerging. So I'm always looking for that thing that can feel new and feel different and be disruptive. But within that, you still need the kind of tenets of massive storytelling. So I think at the end of the day, it's a great idea. We're a creatively led company. We've people at our company, Ben and Howard, myself. Ben's done everything from The Office to Ugly Betty. I've done Face Off, Howard ran National Geographic. It's very broad what we do, but it's because we're kind of creatively led. So with podcasts, there's all different kinds. And I think one thing I've learned about adapting podcasts to television is sometimes they can be a really kind of literal translation of the podcast, which is what you saw in Lore Season 1. But I think Up and Vanish coming out on Oxygen is a very different model from the podcast. And I think that speaks to the creative vision of podcast creators, guys like Terry, who are not just podcast people, they're storytellers. And so they're fun to collaborate with. So one thing I look for is not only the IP, but someone I want to sit in a room with and collaborate and riff with. That's important.
I'm sort of on that note, I have sort of a joint question for you and Terry, because I mean, when I listen to the Minnow Beats Whale catalog, I mean it's one of the most creative assortments of shows I think you can hear from a single network. Everything is so unique and so descriptive and colorful as you listen to it. It's really incredible stuff, and it certainly explains how you've reached 100 million downloads across your catalog. And when I do listen to the shows, the whole time I'm thinking about how this is just you did all the work for adapting already. It's all there. So I have a couple questions. One, I'd like to hear about how you approach your content and programming from your unique perspective, obviously coming from a filmmaker background. I'd love to hear and have you talk to everybody about that. And is adaptation something that is a strong consideration when you began working on it? And then, I know this is a lot, but then after that, between the two of you, I'd love to hear what it's like when adaptation happens, that process of collaborating between the production entity and the creator, and maintaining the integrity and all of that.
Oh, that's the worst. That part. No, collaboration is wonderful, as long as it's not compromised too much.
I'm still trying to get Terry to collaborate with me.
Oh,
so we
no,
can change that.
it's
I'm
happening.
I'm begging Terry, come on.
We're doing it. It's so all of my shows, I've been fortunate enough to, they're all, in some stage of, I've sold them all, let's say. What that means, BP has things on television, I have things that I write scripts for that may one day end up on television. I love TV, that it's the best storytelling out there, I think, and You know, so when I approach creating a new show, it's in the exact same manner I would go about writing a television show. Like it's the whiteboard, it's outlined, it's 12 episodes. It's like, you know, there's no difference between television and podcasting. For me, it's just storytelling. Of course, my podcasts are all documentary. You know, nothing's made up. But yeah, and then the great thing about podcasting is, for me, now that I don't have to talk to a jury of people to determine what's going to happen, but then with the television side of it, it's just all like, it's just rooms and rooms and conference calls of people with smart people with great ideas. But yeah, no, I can't leave podcasting.
To Terry's point, I think where sometimes, you know, if you work in TV, and I'm sure Hernan has learned this, and you're familiar with this, people say like, oh, I don't want my project to get stuck in development hell. So it is hard to get a show made, and I think as podcast creators emerge, a lot of people do have adaptation in mind. They think like, I would love this to be a TV show. And so there's not a clear path to how to do that, because there are kind of MIDI pathways that you can take. And I think it is important to find that right collaborator, whether it's an agency, UTA, which has great creative acumen and can help guide you, or someone like Propagate or myself who can, you know, I think work with someone like Terry. I think what gets lost oftentimes in Hollywood is that a lot, and the majority of podcast creators, I would say, are like, have vision for their story and should have a seat at the writer's table or write the script. But oftentimes, you know, what Hollywood can do is sort of like, say like, oh right, you made this amazing thing that you've spent your entire life thinking about and now is a massive hit, thank you, we'll take that, right? And so, I know that can happen sometimes, because what's happened to a lot of people I've met in the business, some that actually we've now made into TV because they had visual experiences elsewhere. So it is important to find someone that you can communicate with, and I think do that early on, so you can find a way to help you curate what you've curated for the year to curating for both the year and the eye.
And Terry, back to you, have you begun working on adaptations for any of your shows? Can you talk about it? And was that something that you had planned on originally, or did it sort of just come up?
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's not like as insidious as sitting down to plan out something like that's sort of a side thing that will turn into a bigger thing. That's, you know, I love the medium of podcasting, and you know, since I have, everything is written. Like I have written pilots for, you know, tennis, black tapes, and rabbits, and it's good. Like, yeah, maybe initially set out as a bridge to television, but now having been through all of that, it's all about podcasting. You really want something that can sort of become a graphic novel, or, you know, a book, or a video game, or, I mean, I shouldn't say you, the royal you. I think in those terms, like in big story worlds. So podcasting is sort of the center, but around which everything else. So I don't want different silos. I don't want to give my stuff to Sony and have them do a movie, and then give EA the video game, and then I would much rather be, you know, Minnow Beats Whale is the center of it, and then maybe, you know, partner with someone like BP and you know, do the TV series and have a holistic approach to IP. So
That makes sense, because you start from a place where you have complete creative control. You can do whatever you want, whenever you want, with whoever you want, and to take that to take that journey into adaptation, then you relinquish a little bit of control. So it has to be the right fit.
It's kind of old world thinking too. Like it feels like there's going to be something, you know, Bandersnatchian coming up, where it just becomes all, you know, with the kind of media that I'm creating. Like,
I'm so curious about, if it's okay if I ask you a question, I'm so curious about that process for Dirty John. Because like that podcast, I don't know if you guys listened to it, but I could not put it down. And it was so good.
I was scared when I went to bed at night.
Oh my God, it was so good. And I called your office repeatedly and no one called me back because I wanted to make the show. But the show's awesome too. Could you just, how was that whole thing for you guys? How did that come to life? How did it happen?
In that particular case, the LA Times held on to the underlying rights because it was a staff reporter, Chris Coffer, who had reported on the story even before we got involved. But they took it to multiple networks and studios, and UCP came up with the most compelling proposal. They wanted to turn it, and this was very important to Chris Coffer, and indirectly was important to the subjects, that they had both the scripted and the unscripted version. Obviously on the scripted side, I don't know how many of you have listened to Dirty John? All right, quite a big group. I don't know how many have watched the show, but the show has done really well on Bravo. It's been the #1 scripted series on Bravo ever made. It's been one of the top 5 new scripted series in all of basic cable in 2018. And it's been building week after week. And I went to watch the pilot thinking that there wasn't much that we had left out in the story, but then I realized that there were nuances, there were angles, there were points of the story that just like you could tell more from listening to the podcast than from listening, just reading the story, you can actually perceive more from watching the television show that you could from listening to the podcast. But I do still believe that people should listen to the podcast and then watch the television show because they're different experiences.
Definitely. I'd like to, we've been talking a lot about narrative-driven shows because those are the ones that are most often adapted for TV and film. I'd like to, Lauren, talk to you about content that is being put out on Spotify. A lot of it is very talent-based with Joe Biden and Amy Schumer and Guy Raz's Rewind. Can you talk about where you and Spotify are coming from with regards to your content decisions to bet on talent for their shows and how that has been for you in terms of success?
Yeah, sure. So I think there's, at least right now, 2 predominant routes to building value in the podcast space. And we just talked a lot about the narrative route, which is really sitting on top of IP that you can leverage in different windows and models as you seek to repurpose it in whatever way you seek to. And we've done some of that as well. We worked on a project with Vice for El Chapo, which we did in both English and Spanish language. And then we also bought Crime Town Season 2 from Gimlet, an exclusive window on it, which is a narrative-driven podcast approach. But then I think, as you mentioned, we've done a lot to also really focus in on building voices, which are as important, if not arguably potentially even more important to audience cultivation in the early stage as you do try and bring new audiences onto a platform. So for us, we see that we understand content through audiences today. The same person that listens to hip-hop music is not necessarily totally different from the person that listens to country or Latin, but they are distinct audience groups that we can cultivate and speak to in different ways. And one of the ways that we've worked to do that is to find programming that is specific to those audience groups, and that has largely been personality-driven programming. So when we licensed or bought Joe Budden's podcast exclusively, what we were really doing was finding a route to be able to speak to the urban and hip-hop demographic and extend the music experience into a conversational experience about that culture and that creative community. And I think, for us at Spotify, we definitely want to monetize these formats as well. But the first 2 things that we want to do are actually bring new audiences to the platform who may not today be subscribers, and then further engage our existing audience. And when you have we call them always on, these more radio style weekly content experiences. And when you have an always on content experience, you're able to influence behavior on an ongoing basis. And what we see with our user is that when they do discover podcasts on Spotify, they're 2.3 times more engaged as a Spotify user holistically. So their decision to listen to our podcast content is accretive to their overall experience. And so I think that's one of the reasons that we've gone after the personalities. Although it's not to say that we don't want to do stuff in the narrative space as well, we do. The last thing I would say is that it's a lot of work either way, to develop a franchise either way, but building a narrative-driven podcast is a slightly longer development period, with a slightly different marketing schedule, whereas like building a personality-driven podcast is a shorter development period with more time that the personality can kind of iterate and find their audience.
I'm super excited about what you guys are doing at Spotify in the podcast space.
I am too.
I feel like, with all due respect to all of us who work in it, podcasting is still in its infancy. And I think in the next 5 years, we're going to see further accelerated audience growth, and we'll also see new innovative ways and formats for podcasts. And what you guys have done so well in the music space is really dominate, I think, playlist curation and find ways to bring audiences to artists that kind of were on the fringes or kind of disappearing from consumption. And so I'm excited to really see how that kind of brain trust accelerates podcasts in the same way.
I think that brings up some other really important points about how we think about podcasts. So, we think about the format as very agnostically. We want to inspire creators to speak authentically or report authentically or research authentically. And it doesn't need to be an 8-episode, 45-minute each episode type of a format. And I think one of the reasons we've been able to think that way is that our podcast listener isn't the traditional podcast listener. Our podcast listener looks very much like the Spotify music listener. They're, a millennial, and most of them, a lot of them, are listening to this content for the first time. So they're not going with any expectation that it mirrors, the Apple iTunes podcast library. They're just going to seek out another way to inform and entertain themselves.
Definitely. And it's really exciting because with the entry of Spotify into the game, it makes podcasting a lot more accessible to people who may not, be as willing to seek out, the content. And by having it already, a click away when they're listening to music, it opens up and does sort of, the God's work of the podcasting business, which is onboarding new regular active users and listeners. So staying on you, I'm curious, for podcasting, unless I'm mistaken, I just took a look the other day, I think one of the most excellent features for Spotify, at least with me, and I'm a huge Spotify user when it comes to music and sharing music and now listening to podcasts, is the ability to get recommendations on what I like to listen to. Is that something that you see being applied to podcasting, given all of your robust data and analytics?
Yeah, I think so. Already, one of the things that we offer, not on the user side, but on the creator side, which has been really valuable to the podcast creator community, is the Spotify for Podcasters analytics dashboard. And so what that has also allowed, particularly creators who create on a regular cadence to do, is that they can look at their user base and their performance and actually get very relevant insights for how to iterate and change the content format that they're offering to their audience, because you can see exactly when users drop out of your podcast. You can see a lot of demographic information, location information, etc. through the Spotify for Podcasters app. So that's one of the ways in which we're already, I think, leveraging analytics on the creator side. On the consumer side, I think we envision a world where our product does look similar to the product that we offer on the music side. If there's a Discover Weekly and a Release Radar on the music side, there should equally be something like that that's offered up on the podcast side, or on the spoken word audio side. We're starting to test with some things in the Daily Car Mix, which maybe some of you have seen, with some news-based content at the top of that mix. And I think we'll continue to basically seek to better understand our user and what it is he and she wants, and then iterate from there.
That would be great. So my friends can stop asking me all the time for